Welcome back to what are we doing?
The pay-per-view.
Welcome back to this week's pay-per-view. This week's pay-per-view is the anthropometric and physiological characteristics of Brazilian Jiu-jitsu athletes. This is coming at us from the Faculty of Social and Educational Sciences, Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Trondheim, Norway. So this was in 2018, April 2018.
Do you notice that the Department of Health falls within the Department of Sociology and Political Sciences?
Yeah, I skipped over that because this is
Very strange.
It's odd. I didn't want to bring it up.
I didn't even think they were sciences.
I think my brain was just blocking that out. So this was done in the largest jiu-jitsu academy in Norway. So they've quite a big selection. There was 42 athletes involved in the study, and Norway has a notable BJJ athlete, Tarek Hopstock. He's a black belt and has his own choke, or shoulder lock I should say, not choke. So this is coming at us, and they are looking at a few different metrics of these BJJ athletes in this academy. So what we had was 42 athletes. Only one of them couldn't finish due to injury. So there was a variety of different athletes involved. So there was 10 white belts, 16 blue belts, 9 purple belts, 2 brown belts and 1 black belt, and 4 non-ranked. I'm not particularly sure what they mean by the non-ranked athletes, but they were involved in the study nonetheless. They then further broke down these athletes into competitive and non-competitive athletes. These were from 8 different countries, but these are all involved in this particular academy. But the 8 different countries is just an interesting fact in regard to the kind of diversity involved in this study. So BJJ was all of these athletes' main sports and a minimum of 2 years experience in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So they measured the subject's squat to parallel, as is common among all studies, bench press with a 1 second pause on the chest, and their VO2 max. So pretty basic, but in some circumstances quite tell-all metrics if you're trying to analyse a group of athletes and you're trying to get the most bang for your buck among the tests you're going to be doing on these subjects. I think they're 3 pretty great ones. I wouldn't be arguing about or nitpicking on those 3 particular exercises.
No, and definitely in studies like this where you're looking at just a cross section, like they'll do these across like sprinting, long jump, swimmers, whatever it is, and they'll just take a cross section. So these data points are good because you'll see what different athletes, like if you compare these guys' VO2 maxes to a cross-country skier's VO2 max or a biathlon VO2 max, they'll obviously be very different, but you can compare them with some meaning, you know. So a number of interesting things. To be honest, for me, the most interesting thing is the variance or the lack thereof correlation across BJJ athletes, and I think it probably speaks to the kind of different types of people who find success. There's a lot of different styles of jiu-jitsu. There's a lot of different avenues to success with jiu-jitsu, and this kind of just shows how broad that pathway is. In terms of some of the general data, some interesting things you'll find: mean body fat percentage was significantly lower in competitive athletes than it was in non-competitive athletes, which is to be expected. So just 13% in competitive athletes, over 16% in non-competitive athletes, as a good note as well. Quite low body fat percentages on average if you look at this across normal populations or even normative populations of athletes or power athletes. They're certainly on the good end of body composition or condition that they're in generally.
Except for some of the non-competitors, which were up to 20%. So
were they?
Yeah, so there's like 16 plus and minus 4.
So there'll always be people falling outside the bracket, but in general they're in quite good shape, you know.
Some chonkers running around.
Some little chonky monkey. Inverse correlations then between body fat percentage or body fat mass and VO2 max scaled. So obviously people who carried more body fat were less efficient with their oxygen. They weren't as aerobically fit, which is to be expected. You know, you'll often find cases, or rarely find cases, where this isn't true. Also an inverse correlation between age and VO2 max. So older people tended to be less aerobically fit. Quite strong correlations then between body mass and absolute squat weight, and body mass and absolute bench weight. Obviously nothing new here. There's a reason there's weight classes in powerlifting. There's a reason there's weight classes in BJJ as well. And inverse correlation between the number of pull-ups people got and how heavy they were. Walk into any commercial gym in the world and you'll see lighter guys and girls doing better at pull-ups than you will see heavier. Some interesting things, or some slightly off-piste issues. Blue belts had significantly higher back squats than purple and brown belts, which is kind of weird. You wouldn't really expect it, but it speaks once again to the different avenues of success people might have. So those blue belt squats were going up on average around 120 kilos. The purple belt squats were on average 100 kilos or just over it. So by no means were they very well trained strength athletes. Then of course, to state the most obvious thing, and studies love doing this because it's another significant finding, that athletes who did regular strength training had significantly higher strength numbers than those who didn't.
But you have to say that.
You have to say it. You're doing a study, you need some findings, you have to say it. So that's pretty much it for the results. As I said, most of the time these cross-sectional studies, they're just there to give us a little glimpse in, same way where cross-sectional look at biathlon athletes and their VO2 maxes are really, really interesting because their VO2 maxes are some of the highest in the world. This is interesting in the fact that the data is so varied and there's not these big correlations between stronger people having higher belts or whatever. Just some interesting findings on their body comps, really.
So just on the VO2 max aspect there, just to discuss that before we get into the strength numbers. So the VO2 max is on average just 8% higher than the average population, which I think will support the argument in a minute, which is that the vast majority of BJJ athletes are just piss weak, are too weak, are much weaker than you would want athletes to be. So it's a highly demanding sport in terms of aerobic capacity when you do it. It feels highly demanding. As you get better, you'll see matches slow down a little bit. People become more efficient with their movement, and then you would require less of the VO2 max. But they're also, I think it kind of highlights the demand between power and strength versus VO2 max. So we know these are kind of inversely related. We know as we increase one of these qualities, the other quality, due to training time and physiological demands, will go down. So if we spend more time in strength training and power development, our ability to dedicate our adaptation energies and our training time to VO2 max will go down, or maybe parallel or steady out as such. So the biggest thing I think we notice from BJJ and being involved with ourselves is that the average BJJ athlete is not very, very strong in the S&C aspect. So sometimes you'll get these kind of random freaks who just have those genetic capabilities, and through the stimulus applied from BJJ become quite strong. But on average, a lot of athletes are just a lot weaker than you would like them to be in certain circumstances.
The real important thing for me when you look at BJJ is it's kind of like two-pronged approach of why strength training is so important. The first aspect is the entire sport is about tearing the other person apart. Whether you're choking them and getting them to submit, or whether you're cranking their arm, their leg, their foot, their wrist, their shoulder, whatever it is, the entire sport revolves around getting another person to submit. And obviously being stronger, having more tension around the joints, being able to develop more force, more tension, it will allow you to tear the other person apart more effectively. But probably more importantly is that it will allow you to be much more resilient against injuries. So a myriad of studies out there on impact injuries, strain injuries, the amount of force it takes for a joint to become injured, and strength training is the number one thing to kind of get you out of that danger zone. You'll see a lot of the other stuff like the functional movement screenings, the range of motion screenings. A lot of those things just aren't in the literature as much anymore because they're not being found to be as effective as just being very, very strong is. The second part then is being strong in a grappling sport. So Jiu-jitsu, for those of you who mightn't be so aware, is somewhere between judo and kind of standard wrestling. So the actual strength element of it is so important. It's not like you're just doing a non-contact sport. It's not like you're doing a sport that's only pushing with your legs or only pushing or pulling with your back. It's grip strength orientated, it's core strength, it's leg strength, upper body strength. Everything is so important to actually carrying out the sport. So like the strength training you do in a standard S&C session is incredibly sport specific to Jiu-Jitsu due to the fact that you're pushing, you're pulling, you're forcing rotation, you're resisting rotation. All of these things are essential to actually winning in the sport.
So if you look at wrestling and judo, their competition success rate is positively correlated with increased absolute strength numbers. The numbers in jiu-jitsu are under-investigated at the moment. I don't think there's a lot of investigating done on it yet. Obviously, jiu-jitsu is growing more every year, especially in the last few years. There's been an explosion in popularity. So hopefully we may see interesting data in that in the next few years. But by and large, being stronger in jiu-jitsu makes so much sense. So for example, if you look at the scenario, anytime there's submissions, the stronger and faster you are putting a submission in or a choke, the more likely you are to get that choke. And I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So a lot of times you'll see if someone has a particular choke on you or a particular submission, the more time you have while they're applying that choke, the more likely you are to remove yourself from that situation. But you'll see with a lot of the best grapplers and best jiu-jitsu artists, when they apply a choke, it's as hard as they can and as fast as possible to give you a limited amount of time to escape from that, to move your body to different positions. So the stronger you are, the more likely you are to be able to put these into effect. So there's a variety of different reasons in jiu-jitsu why we just want to encourage people to be stronger. So the likelihood, if you're watching this video, it may be that we're already preaching to a choir, or preaching to the choir, I suppose, but in the chance that you've stumbled upon this and you are kind of on the fence about S&C for jiu-jitsu, we'd really like to encourage you to partake in it. Not necessarily by doing one of our programs, but doing it at all. So there's a quote in the study where they say nearly half of all the athletes who are involved in this study partake in some kind of S&C work. Now they're saying that in the manner that that's great that nearly half of them do it. What I would say is only half of these athletes do S&C work, which I think is astounding. So if you look at, there's no real negatives to doing S&C work for your BJJ until you get to the point where you're too tired for your BJJ sessions, for your wrestling sessions. It's a very simple way of getting slightly better jiu-jitsu, but getting better strength levels is very, very simple. So getting better jiu-jitsu is very, very complicated. There's a lot of techniques involved. It's a dynamic sport. There is a lot of training time involved. There's a particular psychology involved. Whereas getting your strength numbers to what we would consider pretty reasonable for strength athletes, which the athletes in this subject were well below, is not that difficult and can be done quite, in terms of other strength sports, quite passively, I would say. So in relation to like how much time a powerlifter or a weightlifter will need to get better at their strength stuff, the amount of time a BJJ athlete will need to get better at their strength stuff is very passive considered to that. So if we look at a weightlifter might do between 9 and 14 sessions a week. A powerlifter might be looking at 6 quite intensive sessions, which may take anywhere in the region of 2.5 hours. A jiu-jitsu athlete and all these amateur athletes here could literally do 2 sessions a week for most of the year and will very progressively get to good strength numbers if they go about it in the correct manner. I think the thing to look at here as well, though, is that while nearly half of all these BJJ athletes did do some kind of S&C work, their numbers were still pretty piss poor. So their average body weight was in the 80 plus or minus, I think, something like 10 kilos. So we're not looking at 50 kilo men who are nearly benching double body weight or something like that, or squatting 120. These are above average or maybe close to average body weight in terms of strength athletes, and they are just not strong. There's no real reason not to be stronger.
I think when you look at that, when you look at the findings in this study, right, very poor strength numbers. When we look at prerequisites, we'd always look for in people, they're nowhere near that. They're probably at a just above baseline level that you'd expect someone to walk in off the street with. Realistically, if half of them are strength training and their numbers are only this high, you have to look at what you're doing as your strength and conditioning work. Like, is the strength and conditioning work some sort of kettlebell workout or band workout or sandbag workout that you do before class or after class or something? If that is the case and you're only getting these values, then you really need to look at, like, firstly, the efficiency of what you're doing. Like, you might be doing it, you say you're doing it, so you're probably doing it 2 or 3 days a week. You're getting almost nothing from it, so why are you still doing it? Like, you're just taking up valuable time for yourself and for other coaches and stuff like that. If you're in the case now where you might have tried S&C before and you didn't like it or it didn't work, or you're doing something at the moment, you're not sure if it's working, just go with the most basic thing you can possibly do. Don't do some sort of bodybuilding split where it's like upper body, lower body, push and pull or whatever. That's for bodybuilders. That's not for you. That's for people who put pictures on Instagram all the time. You need to squat, you need to deadlift, you need to press of some kind, and you need to row. And you just need, over the course of 8 to 12 weeks, you need all of those numbers to progressively get heavier. You probably need to start with some amount of volume, like moderately high volume, 4 sets of 10 or 4 sets of 12. They don't have to be super heavy. All you need to do is make sure over the course of those 8 to 12 weeks, those 12s slowly go to 10s, and then they slowly go to 8s, 6s and 4s. And then that weight might go from 50% of 1RM up to 85% of 1RM for a set of 4 at the end of it. You can probably keep the number of sets relatively similar, probably go somewhere from 4 sets of something to 3 sets of something towards the end. It doesn't have to be complicated, and you will get massive bang for your buck for it, particularly if you're doing one of those kind of really passive styles of training at the moment. Just getting in and doing the some people comment on our videos and say the old school method. Realistically, that's the only method. There's a reason all professional athletes and Olympians will train like that. So that's where you should be concentrating your effort.
So I like to come at this from an area of what would people say to argue against doing S&C. So they might say something like, well, the best S&C or the best jiu-jitsu athletes don't do S&C. They don't do very much of it. They're not very strong. The initial argument I'd say to that was, how much better would these athletes be if they had a reasonable base in S&C? How much better would they be if they were stronger? So if we look at jiu-jitsu, if we look at judo and wrestling, having higher correlations with competition success in relation to their absolute strengths, what's the likelihood that jiu-jitsu is vastly different to that? And I think it's if we put context on this and we know what's happening in jiu-jitsu, we would say, oh, of course he would be a lot better. So if they had that same level of BJJ ability, their technique and their just skill level was that level, but their S&C doubled, do you not think that there's a massive likelihood that they would be much better at jiu-jitsu? It's still a physical art, it's still a physical sport, an incredibly physical sport, one of the most physical sports. Now I know you might look at certain kind of higher level jiu-jitsu athletes, and I know it's called the gentle art, and it's really pushed as like technique orientated, and strength will only get you so far. But technique and strength will get you really far. Now, there is one thing as well that we need to comment on. So if you do go down an avenue of saying, well, what about those best athletes? The level of performance-enhancing drugs in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is on par with weightlifting, if not more.
Yeah.
It's so it has been involved in it recently in the last few months. It seems to be almost an open secret. Testing at either the ADCC or IBJJF is limited to nil by the looks of things. It doesn't seem to be a thing up until world level.
Even at world level, like most professional grapplers aren't just doing worlds. They'll do the EBIs, these kind of competitions. I haven't seen a sport. So weightlifting is incredibly dirty at the top level. If you're a professional weightlifter, you're on gear 99% of the time, right? Most amateur weightlifters aren't on gear. Whereas jiu-jitsu seems to be CrossFit-esque in its proliferation of performance-enhancing drugs. It is everywhere. And this is the thing where you see...
I think everyone knows that. Everyone watching, you're not convinced. There's no one to convince here.
No, like...
in terms of jiu-jitsu,
It's the opposite of CrossFit in that way, where everyone seems to know and seems to be open about it. But it gives that flawed perception, like Gerf was talking about, where you'll get these phenomenal athletes, right? Professional grapplers, professional submission fighters who are making their living off doing it. They're jacked. They're in phenomenal shape. And then they say, strength training doesn't really matter. For me, like, strength and conditioning doesn't really matter. If you're blasting test and deck all year, strength training doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. It would be more beneficial if you did do it, but you'll get some phenomenal results without it.
Because there's a couple of variables working in their favour in this scenario where they are using performance-enhancing drugs. So they have the fact that jiu-jitsu is a very physical sport, so they get a lot of stimulus, which will encourage the performance-enhancing drugs to produce and emphasise certain attributes, so the physicality will be adapted, and advanced. They'll also be some of the genetic elite, so they'll respond very well to training and performance enhancing drugs. And it's just a case of kind of in spite of, not because of, so these athletes are just very, very good and they train a lot. And if you use performance enhancing drugs, you're able to get away with certain capacities, but it brings up these base capacities without having to train them certainly directly, Now, it's not going to be a game changer in the fact that it's not going to make you go from a blue belt to a brown belt level, but if you incorporate it throughout your career, there's a variety of different benefits to it, and there's just no reason not to do it.
The last benefit I'd say, and this is just kind of an aside, if you're a competitive jiu-jitsu athlete, and obviously you're competing in a weight class sport, or nearly all competitions will be weight classed, unless it's some sort of strange invitational competition.
Or you get forced to go up to the ultra heavies.
Or you get forced to go ultra heavies, like us two guys. The main thing you're looking at is the body mass and what that mass does for you, right? So in any sport where there's a weight class, your body composition is going to be incredibly important. Strength training is a very, very useful way of you gaining muscle tissue and improving your body composition. So it's not just that you gain muscle tissue and then you have more muscles, so you're going to be heavier. You'll gain muscle tissue, your body will then require more energy. That energy balance will be easier to sort out. It will be a lot easier to walk around at a much lighter or much more favourable body fat percentage when you have more muscle. And it's just all around better for you competing in a weight class dominated sport.
Now, while I said you don't have to do one of our programs, we certainly have a program for you. It's Seek Strength for combat athletes. So it's 4 sessions a week and it's 10 weeks. First 6 weeks are primarily strength focused and the last 4 weeks are power training. So it's good to kind of have a phasic structure to your training. So strength first and then move into the power production. Now, 4 sessions a week might be a lot for some people. So what we have a lot of people doing on that program is they'll often take that program and do it over the course of 20 weeks and they will do 2 sessions a week, and there'll be 2-3 sessions of their combat sport specific work. So approximately 5 training days a week, which a lot of these athletes aren't on the performance enhancing drugs, and which is more than enough for them. However, we do have a good few athletes who will take those 10 weeks away from their training. So you have 52 weeks in the year, so I'm led to believe, and they'll take kind of 10 of those and they'll reduce down their sport specific work and they'll do like 1 to 2 sessions of those, and then for those 10 weeks they'll put a lot of effort into their strength training and their conditioning work. And then, as we know with strength training hangs around for years, even if you're not doing any strength training at all. So the adaptations you get from strength training last a very, very long time, and so they reap these benefits of those 10 weeks in the year, and they can carry on through until next year or all the way through the rest of their competitive season. And hopefully you have some kind of competitive season, some kind of phasic structure to your training. So Seek Strength for combat athletes, we'll put a link to it below. Highly encourage you, if you do get us, to join the group and let us know how you're getting on. A lot of people are very, very happy with the program. It's been out for a couple of months now, so we're very happy with how it went. It's just very, very basic training principles. I suppose we wouldn't call it the old school way, but certain people would say it that.
It's the way.
It's the E way. It's just a smart way of training, and it's very, very basic stuff. It's not fancy. It's barbells and dumbbells, and that's about it really. And a squat rack and some bumper plates, and you'll be good to go.